Hey folks, I just wanted to do this response video because I saw the interview that Alex O'Connor did with Rhett McLaughlin, and I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was a good conversation, a good articulation of Rhett's journey out of Christianity, and he made some really, I think, true and helpful points about the things that go on in Christian community and Christian culture. And then I saw this response video by Sean McDowell and William Lane Craig. And you know what? I was somewhat disappointed. And even though I'm a Christian and I've followed William Lane Craig for years, like over a decade, and I've learned a lot from him and I really appreciate his work, it just seemed like the tone of the video, or maybe the motivation of the video, was somewhat disingenuous. And by that, I don't mean that they had any sort of like nefarious intentions or anything. What I mean by that is, something that apologists tend to do, and they often don't realize that they're doing it's more of a psychological or a cognitive kind of thing. But the feel of the video was that these apologists wanted to kind of swoop in and bandage up a couple of things that came out of this really good interview about deconstruction, just so that the Christian community and Christians around the globe or the country can feel more comfortable about some of the things that were stated in that interview and maybe not worry about it so much. So it's just kind of a way of maybe painting over some of the realities that Rhett was talking about in this discussion with Alex O'Connor. This also really just kind of prevents Christian community from being able to sit with those things that they talked about in that interview and really just kind of internalize them and think about them and learn from them. It just it comes in really quick, tries to just fix all the problems, board up the windows, and then just move on so that everybody just feels comfortable and doesn't have to worry about these sorts of things. That was the vibe that I got. So anyway, there were a few reasons why I think that, and the way that they went about this discussion, I feel like there were some issues that can be addressed. So let's take a look and see what we can figure out in terms of this conversation.
It has well over 2 million views and has created quite the conversation and stir online. Given that
if it seems like it's really fast, that's because I watch on 1.5 times.
Doesn't that kind of make God an asshole? Why did these people write this? Where did this idea come from?
I thought, you know what? If Bill is available to come on and respond with me to this would be perfect. So Dr. Craig, there's a combination here, I think, of important lessons for the church and apologists, as well as a few points that I think it'd be helpful for people if we offer our responses. So are you ready to look at 10 clips together and give me your reaction?
I certainly am. I'm looking forward to interacting with Rhett on these questions.
Perfect. Well, let's take a look at the first clip.
Certainty is a really important aspect of religious faith, and especially Christianity, and especially evangelical Christianity, because I think that agreeing with a set of propositional statements is actually what, if you ask somebody to describe, they might say, well, it's about a relationship with Jesus. But it's like, well, yeah, but what does that mean? These propositional statements come up. It's like, well, I believe this about Jesus. If any church worth its salt has a "we believe" place on their website, right? That's what I thought, right? And so I think that being certain and being right about these things comes at a premium. It is really, really important. So I thought that being certain was very important.
Here's really the question, Bill. How central is certainty in the church today? And how important should it be for Christians?
I think that being certain is not important, Sean. I think what's important is to know these truths, but certainty is neither necessary nor sufficient for knowledge. In the first place, certainty is not necessary for knowledge because we can know things on the basis of probabilistic evidence. Indeed, this is the way we know anything in history, for example. Neither is certainty sufficient for knowledge because some are terribly, terribly certain are desperately wrong. Certainty is a psychological property that is neither necessary nor sufficient for knowledge. And so I think that it's simply a mistake to prize certainty as something that's really important in the Christian life.
That's a really helpful distinction. I have a lot of sympathy with Rhett for this because I think there's a huge segment of the evangelical church.
The nuance that Dr. Craig is articulating doesn't really exist in practice. If you've got people who are evangelizing and trying to convince others that what they believe is true, they're not really acting as if they're not certain, right? There's sort of a condescension that occurs here, and we'll unfortunately see a little bit of that later in this video.
It's really, really helpful. Let's take a look at the second clip.
I can agree that God preordained a certain number of people to be his children, which definitely means that a certain number of people are not predestined to be his children. In fact, statistically speaking, the majority of people who've ever lived and live right now, and they're going to be in hell. So I believe that because the Bible says it. But, and I like paused because I was a little bit nervous. I was like, but doesn't that kind of make God an asshole? And they were like, no. He's just like, you can't understand. First of all, we all deserve to be in hell. The fact that he would save, he's justified in not saving anyone.
Yeah, that's the line, isn't it?
And so then I was like, yeah, but he decided to create a world in which these beings would exist. Like, he still made that choice. Doesn't that still kind of make him an asshole? So I was having thoughts like that at like 20 years old, but was able to continue to carry like a cognitive dissonance that allowed me to still be a very strong Christian and just be like, okay, there are things that I don't understand. God's got that figured out. That'll be the first question I ask him when I get to heaven.
Essentially, here's the question, Bill. Is God morally reprehensible for creating a world in which most people will not believe in him? And how can Christians live with cognitive dissonance of this kind?
Well, I have to say that I don't agree with Rhett that people are unilaterally preordained to salvation or damnation by God. I don't think that the Bible teaches that at all. What the Bible teaches is that election is primarily a corporate notion and only secondarily an individual notion. So, for example, in the Old Testament, the object of God's election was not individual persons. It was a people. It was a nation, the nation of Israel. And God said, you are my chosen people, and I will bless you and give you a posterity and a land. Now, those promises to the corporate group, Israel, were not guaranteed to every individual person in Israel. Those persons could fail to live up to the demands of the covenant. They could rebel against God and be unbelievers. For example, we know the story of the people of Israel who had Aaron, the brother of Moses, build them a golden calf, and they worshiped and served the golden calf rather than the God of the Bible. And as a result, God's judgment was incurred by them. So remember people. But again, not every Gentile or every Jew is an heir of salvation. Rather, it is those who place their faith in Christ Jesus who become the heirs of these promises. So election isn't God's picking out Susan or Paul or John to be saved and choosing to damn Billy and Karen and others to hell. Not at all. Rather, what God says is, I want everyone to be saved, and he gives sufficient grace for salvation to every person that he creates, and then he leaves it up to us whether or not we want to align ourselves with that elect body of people or not. So our salvation lies in our own hands, and God is not to be blamed for unbelief or judgment. I don't think that these sorts of things are unilaterally preordained in the way that Rhett must have been taught.
That's a great distinction. A couple things jump to my mind. I think, in some ways, the critique of hell is understandable emotionally. I don't like it. I have loved ones who don't believe in God. I would be completely lying if I didn't say it bothered me. But of course, two questions come to mind. Number one, when we critique hell as being unjust, that assumes that humans have value and ought not be treated this way. And there's a standard by which we can critique God. I want to flip the scenario around and say, where does that standard come from if there is no God? That doesn't answer it, but to me helps place the question in terms of really philosophically explaining human value and where right and wrong come from.
I think the problem with this response is a couple things. Mainly, I think they miss the point, or Dr. Craig misses the point somewhat of what Rhett is trying to say, I believe. So yes, he does allude to Calvinists and this idea of election and the idea that some people are chosen for salvation and others not. But the thing I think that he misses, and I don't want to put words in Rhett's mouth, but I think the point that he's thinking and is trying to make here is, regardless of what your systematic theology is of hell or damnation, it really doesn't work. It's the same sort of thing, even if you're an Arminian, really. And the reason is because, as he says, why would God even create a world in which it is not just possible, but he supposedly knows is going to involve humans who are eventually going to make certain decisions and suffer in some way? It really doesn't even work even on the Arminian position, because if God truly is merciful and loving, it would be better for God not to even create a world that had these humans existing in it that would eventually come to such suffering, right? It would have just been better to not create this world, or at least humanity, at all. So it doesn't really matter what your system of hell is. The point about this referring to Calvinism, this is kind of missing the point that Rhett is making, which is that just the whole idea of hell doesn't really work if we believe these things about God, God's goodness and love. The Sean McDowell makes a comment about how it's an emotional argument, right? That it just doesn't seem right that we would be condemned to hell or something like this. And he, alludes to this this innate moral knowledge. But the thing is, if we do believe, or if Christians largely do believe that we as humans are created with this innate understanding of what is good and what is bad, it seems like this is the most basic sensitivity or sensibility that we could have in terms of a morality or a system like that. Don't you think that if nothing else, we can at least identify that it is bad for a human being to suffer for eternity? And there, you can get into the whole conversation about whether or not there's eternal conscious torment or annihilationism or whatever. But the point that he's making is, and I think what's very true along with this is that it's fairly simple. We don't have to get too deep into the weeds of where morality comes from or how it works in order to know that we're right in considering this suffering for eternity is wrong and it's bad. And so it doesn't make any sense at all to say that this God, who has these supposedly beautiful and good characteristics that we consider, it doesn't make sense to suggest that God would want or allow any sort of suffering on that sort of level. So I think the attempts to try to absolve this supposed system of humans being condemned or even choosing to be separated from God, I just don't think that really works if God supposedly is omnipotent enough to have created a system where that didn't have to happen, or just not created that system at all.
And ought not be treated this way, and there's a standard by which we can critique God. I want to flip the scenario around and say, where does that standard come from if there is no God? That doesn't answer it, but to me helps place the question in terms of really philosophically explaining human value and where right and wrong come from. The other thing, and this is a big...
Okay, so he said that Jesus taught hell, and so that's what makes him comfortable affirming the idea. Just as a quick side note, this is not a whole discussion on hell, but he's making, this definition of hell that they're discussing is an assumption. Well, I should say it's an interpretation of what Jesus taught. So Jesus uses certain terms in Greek, or at least the terms in the New Testament are written in Greek, and those are translated into English terms. And so there's a lot of cultural context that comes with understanding them. And certainly there's a huge debate about what it really means when Jesus was teaching about hell, what that really entails. So it would be a bit of a leap to say Jesus taught this idea of, people suffering for eternity or something like that. Just a side note.
To me, but why believe in something like hell? When it's all said and done, I'm convinced because I think Jesus taught it. And if Jesus lived a sinless life, did miracles, gave us the most profound or some of the most profound moral teachings and rose from the grave, there is a certain authority there to speak on these matters, whether we like it or not. That's why the central question, I think, is the identity of Jesus.
Yes, I don't think in one sense God sends anybody to hell. Rather, people send themselves by irrevocably and freely separating themselves from God forever. But I took it that Rhett's objection was that people's fate is preordained or predestined by God. And I just disagree with that. That's not the way I read the Bible.
All right, good take. Let's move to clip.
So again, if the God, at least in William Lane Craig's system, if that God, in his case, he's a Molinist God, if this God knows everything that could happen or is going to happen, or however you want to put it, and creates this world anyway, knowing that there are going to be people who are going to suffer, however you look at it, whether it's their choice or not, it just doesn't work. It doesn't seem like this supposedly all-loving and merciful God would create this system. And so, again, I'm not necessarily arguing for a view of hell here. I'm just trying to clarify what the Rhett has probably thought a lot more deeply about than they're giving him credit for. And I think this is really the main point that he's trying to make.
Number 3.
Jessie, my wife, who did come from like a young earth creationist background, like that's, you know, that's what she was taught growing up. When I came home and I was like, we need to talk about something. And I said, I am thoroughly convinced that evolution is true and that we are related to every other animal. I believe in common ancestry. And I just think that it is not just, I sort of think it's true. It's just like my reading has led me to think that if this isn't true, then I actually can't determine what anything that's true. It's so overwhelming because I'd read additionally to that. She just starts crying because this represented, she knew what this represented.
Right.
This was the seismic shift. And I think a lot of people that I tell this story to are like, what do you mean? But there's all these Christians that believe in evolution, Like, I can't believe that this was so significant for you. But I think the reason it was is because at that point, I realized how wrong I could be about something so fundamental.
Yeah.
And I never, ever considered that I might be wrong about something so fundamental. And then, not only was I wrong, but all of these Christian apologists who were so sure about their critiques of evolution, they had missed the boat so significantly on this that suddenly I was like, can I trust anything else they've got to say about this? So that was the first big domino.
Yeah.
Essentially, here's the question. How big of a domino in one's faith is evolution? And what lessons should Christian apologists learn from Rhett's experience?
I think that the evidence in favor of common ancestry is good, especially the evidence of microbiology. But the question of common descent is not a fundamental tenet of the Christian faith. It is tangential, and therefore one can easily change one's mind about this, as many people do. And I think very helpful here is the philosopher W.V.O. Quine's notion of a web of beliefs. Quine points out that all of our beliefs are not on the same level. Rather, our beliefs are like a web, a spider's web, where you have certain beliefs that are deeply ingrained, very close to the center of the web, and then gradually radiate out the circumference of the web. And beliefs that are deeply ingressed near the center of the web are more fundamental. And if they are given up, then there are repercussions that reverberate throughout the web of beliefs. But if you pluck out a strand that's nearer the circumference, then it won't have the same sort of repercussions as if you were to remove one of those central beliefs. And my point is that your views about common ancestry are in no way part of the core of one's beliefs. It's tangential and therefore easily changed. Now, I think the difficulty is that certain young earth creationists, like apparently Rhett himself at one time, have a distorted understanding of the web of beliefs. They think that right at the center of the web is belief in special young earth creationism. And therefore, if that's given up, it has enormous repercussions throughout the web of belief. I think this is nowhere better epitomized than in a poster that I saw a few years ago, which showed two little islands with towers built on these little islands. And then the people in the towers were lobbing cannonballs back and forth at each other. And one island was labeled creation, and the other island was labeled evolution. And the towers that were built on these islands were labeled Christianity and atheism. And as I looked at this, I thought this is completely upside down. Atheism is not built upon the theory of evolution, and Christianity is not built upon the foundation of special creationism. If anything, it's exactly the worst. It would reverse. It would be that if you are an atheist, then you have to be an evolutionist. Or if you were a Christian, then you would believe in creation. But you see how twisted, how upside down those theological priorities were. And someone who has that sort of system of beliefs, apparently as Rhett did, is going to find the abandonment of young earth creationism to be incredibly disruptive and personally shattering.
Bill, I personally assess the genetic evidence for common descent a little bit differently, which is not the issue we're discussing or obviously debating here. But I think you're right. The core issue is, can naturalism itself, a naturalistic mechanism, account for all the complexity and diversity of life? That's why I think the question of common descent is very different than the kind of concern we would have for a purely naturalistic process of evolution. Now, of course, this raises important theological and biblical questions we're not getting to right now. But one thing that I say to my students is specifically, I'll say, look, and these are my students at Biola, even if evolution were true, it can't explain some of the most important worldview questions that every belief system needs to explain. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is the universe fine-tuned? The origin of life, origin of morality, origin of consciousness, applicability of math, near-death experiences. None of evolution alone would explain any of those things. So it's such a small pinnacle in what a worldview needs to explain. All right, let's move to clip number 4.
Okay, so here's the problem with this now. They go on about evolution, and this is utterly missing the point that Rhett is making. He is talking about how this is the first domino, right? He said that that's the term that he used, and they parroted it in their response. But then they kind of ignored it. So the point that he's making is this is a paradigm shifting thing for so many people, and especially Christians and evangelical or even fundamentalist Christians. And what it means for this to be the first domino is that you really have to change your perspective on how you approach the Bible, how you understand your own theology, how you understand orthodoxy, and how you think philosophically. Like, it just changes really everything about how you think about the world. And so I would say I'm a good example, actually, of how this topic was what got me to dig much, much deeper into the Bible and theology and discussing all of these topics. And as you move down the rabbit hole further and further, and I forget if Rhett mentioned it in this particular clip, but he does say it in this conversation. He says that started getting closer and closer to Jesus. And so it's not the question of evolution that made him just automatically switch gears and lose his faith. That's kind of the way it is for some people. But for him, what he's describing here, and the way it is for a lot of people, is that once you realize how to read the Bible, and once you recognize how we can approach interpretation and the things that we believe about our faith, there's a way that all of this starts to shift, and you just look at everything differently. And what he means when he says it gets closer and closer to Jesus is, sure, the evolution issue is the starting point, but once you start to think about, okay, what about other things in the Bible, like the story of Jonah and the whale, or the writings of Paul, the authorship of these letters, and then eventually you start to think about, well, what about the historicity of the events of the Gospels and Jesus's life and ministry? And you start to think about all of these things, and what you realize is there's a lot to be questioned, and there's a lot of reason to doubt. And so it sounds like that was, this, as he's saying it, Rhett, that is, this evolution understanding of creation got him to start digging deeper and looking at the Bible in a more analytical way, in a more critical way. And there are lots of things that scholars bring to the table when you start to do that, and eventually you start to realize there are many, many things that I assume and I take for granted. This is the Christian, of course. We assume and we take for granted, and then we realize, oh shoot, nothing really is as necessarily as firm as I would want it to be, or as I would hope for it to be. So that's what he means when he says it's the domino effect. This is just a starting point. It changes the paradigm of how we think about our whole world, and so it even gets to the point where you start to think about the life of Jesus and things going on in the New Testament, and it's typical that people start to question that, and it sounds like he did, and that's probably one of the things that has gotten him to lose his faith.
There was never, I think that there was, especially in those days, in the college days, there was zero curiosity about whether or not I might be wrong.
Yeah.
That wasn't even up for debate. There was full confidence and no curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And I am in a very different place. I think those two things have reversed at this point in my life.
Right.
Very low confidence in my perspective and high curiosity for all of this stuff.
Really, the question here is, how do you balance confidence and curiosity about your faith?
Yeah. I've got to say that I am also amazed, as Rhett is, at people's lack of curiosity about things. Some people have no interest at all in how the universe began, or in the mystery of the applicability of mathematics to physical phenomena, or to the basis for objective moral values and duties, or the reality of the soul. And I just find it incredible that people can be so incurious and so apathetic about these deep questions. And so I find among unbelievers a great deal of incuriosity about these important things.
The older I get, the more confident I am that Christianity is true, and the more curious I am about what others believe and why they believe it. My confidence comes from studying this for a lifetime, but also just living it out, understanding my shortcomings, the beauty of grace. Like, I think there's a way, humanly speaking, to be confident, not certain, and be curious and willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And I think we're fooling ourselves that we can just be curious and not confident, confident and not curious. The key is to kind of ground both, and I think there's practically a way to do this. Let's move on to the next clip.
It was one aspect of that argument, of that case. Probably the most famous one is, well, why would the disciples die for a lie? Mm-hmm. And then when I really looked into that, and then I found that, well, I don't think I can actually historically defend that anyone died for something that they knew to be a lie. Like, I think that this can be explained by them being deceived, right? They could just be wrong about what they saw or their perspective. But I think the bigger picture was, as I started looking at different perspectives on the historical Jesus.
Is it reasonable that the disciples were simply wrong for what they claimed to have seen about the risen Jesus? Could they have been deceived and then, willing to die for something that was false?
I was surprised at what Rhett said here. No one died, he says, for what they knew to be a lie. Well, that's exactly the point. They died or were willing to die for what they believed to be the truth. No one would die for what he knew to be a lie. So what that implies is that the disciples were either deceivers or deceived. This is the classic dilemma that apologists for Jesus posed. Were the disciples deceivers or were they deceived? Now, if they weren't deceivers, then what hypothesis would appeal to their being sincerely mistaken about Jesus' resurrection? Well, it's pretty hard to think of one, Sean. The only ones I can think of would be the wrong tomb hypothesis of Kearsarge Lake, which generated no following, or it would be the hallucination hypothesis that is still debated today. And so one would need to examine whether or not the resurrection appearances could have been explained as hallucinations that the disciples mistook for appearances of Jesus alive from the dead.
That's a great take. I think deceivers or deceived is a good way to look at it. Well, the problem is, even if the disciples were deceived, you still have the conversion of James, you still have the conversion of Paul, and the evidence for the empty tomb that are all going to require some explanation. That's where the disciples being deceived alone is not going to get us there. All right, the next clip.
It began to dawn on me that...
Okay, so I think the problem with that response is that it's an extreme oversimplification to boil it down to a binary of two options there. That's not at all a good representation of the scholarship that has been advanced on the resurrection. I would say one of the best discussions of this is Dale Allison's book, The Resurrection of Jesus Christ, or something like that. But Dale Allison goes through exhaustively, he goes through many aspects of the resurrection accounts and the gospel accounts. And I would just say that, so at the end of that, what he does is he essentially comes down neutral, and even though he's a Christian, he makes it very, very clear that there is no definitive evidence either way, and we can be confidently uncertain about what happened. One example, though, just to throw this out there, that is an alternative to what Dr. Craig was saying, is there's the liberal theology idea of what happened, and that's that the resurrection was a real thing, but not a literal thing. Maybe not a physical thing, but it's something that did happen. The way Dale Allison puts it is, it could be that the disciples saw an apparition, which is a little bit different than a hallucination, and because it doesn't just come from their minds, it's something that happens to them, right? It's something that really does happen. So, in any case, there are a variety of explanations. Again, this is not a discussion about whether or not the resurrection happened, but the point that I'm making is this response to Rhett's comments is of extreme oversimplification of the case, and really, it's just an attempt to kind of wash over the complex realities of what's happening with the resurrection.
I don't know exactly what happened with Jesus. I don't know specifically the nature of his death. Like, was he left on the cross? Was he thrown into a large, mass grave? Was he put into a rich man's grave by Joseph of Arimathea? Was that invented? I don't know. But what seems to be pretty clear to me is that it's almost certain that there's some explanation for how it all started that isn't that he actually raised from the dead. In my compulsion to believe that he raised from the dead, it is a religious position. It is a faith position. It's not an historically defensible position to the degree that these Christian apologists make it out to be.
Is there good reason to doubt the crucifixion and burial of Jesus? And to what degree really is the resurrection historically defensible?
I was really surprised here that Rhett would call into question the what happened to the body of Jesus. The evidence that the vast majority of New Testament historians find corpse was in fact interred in a tomb by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. And the question I'd like to ask Rhett is, where is your curiosity? He says that he's almost certain that there is an explanation of how it all started that does not involve Jesus' resurrection. Now, this is just amazing to me. He said that the more curious he is, the less confident he is. It's like a teeter-totter. As his curiosity goes up, his confidence goes down. So as his confidence goes up, his curiosity declines. And yet here he says he is almost certain that Jesus did not rise. Now that betokens an incredible lack of curiosity on Rhett's part. Virtually all skeptical scholars today say that they have no idea how this movement got started. There is no naturalistic explanation that is accepted by a significant number of scholars. And so I wonder, where does Rhett's confidence that it didn't happen come from? It's certainly not from the evidence. And how does he explain this lack of curiosity on his part?
That's a really good take, Bill. I think, I always hesitate to say something almost certain, but historically speaking, the crucifixion of Jesus, if anything is almost certain, it would be that, because of the multiple attestation, Josephus and Tacitus, outside of biblical accounts, the embarrassing nature of it. There's a strong case for the burial too. So I think I'm with you that there's maybe a little bit of an inconsistency here and a lack of curiosity. For all the things someone's going to reject about the resurrection, it strikes me as being more methodological or worldview than the facts that he actually mentioned, would be my take from listening to it.
All right. So, there's, I would say, somewhat of a duplicitous thing going on here. Maybe double standard is a more fair term, because they're saying he is exhibiting a lack of curiosity by being certain about something, so they have suggested that Christians don't have to be certain, and they claim that they're not certain, but they definitely do behave in such a way. Okay, fine, maybe that's neither here nor there, but the idea that Rhett is not curious, this is a wildly unfair claim, I think. This suggestion is kind of, it's just really unfortunate, because how much more curiosity is there than a person who believed something so much that they were, an evangelist and apologist for it, and then delved into it to such to the extent that they left that worldview. He changed his whole entire worldview, which for a Christian, that means that's an entire shift in your community. Like, your entire social circle is completely obliterated and it's utterly changed. So I don't think that it was flippant at all. And I think it's the curiosity that led him to learn all of these different things and take him down the rabbit hole, and all of the different dominoes that fell down from his investigation, that was what led him to where he is now. So I just don't think that it's fair at all to say that he exhibits a lack of curiosity.
That is what I suspect. And that's why I said I don't think this confidence comes from the evidence. I suspect, Sean, as you said, there are view considerations that underlie this extraordinary confidence and lack of curiosity.
Okay, sorry, I had to interrupt that, because he says that the certainty doesn't come, or certainty that the resurrection did not literally happen, doesn't come from the evidence. But there's a major assumption there being made that the evidence demonstrates that the resurrection happened. Now, of course, a Christian apologist is going to say that. A Christian apologist is going to say, yes, the conclusion of all of this evidence is that, yes, the resurrection happened. However, again, this is just a disingenuous statement, because I think a person who is being intellectually honest and really following through will come to the conclusion that it's not conclusive. And this is why I really appreciated Dale Allison's discussion of the resurrection, because he does honestly get to that point where he says that we cannot be certain about what happened, and there's not necessarily enough evidence to say one thing or another. So the evidence can suggest different things, but it does not conclusively point to the resurrection necessarily. So that's, of course, just a rhetorical response by an apologist to say that the evidence points to the resurrection.
That would need to be explored.
All right, let's look at the next clip.
I'm pretty sure that there is a development as the Gospels go on about the description of the tomb. So, like, in Mark's gospel, presumably, I think it just says that Jesus is put in a tomb. And in Matthew's gospel, it becomes a new tomb. And then I think by Luke, it's a new tomb in which no one had been laid. Or maybe that's John. I can't remember the details, but there's things that you wouldn't notice that I'd never come across this idea before. If the empty tomb is an important apologetic to Jesus' resurrection, well, we know that the tomb was empty. In order to know that the tomb was empty, you need to ensure that Jesus was probably the only person laid in it, because otherwise it could have been mixed up with someone else or something like this. And so there is this hint at evidence of an earlier apologetical motive to make the tomb a new tomb, which means there's no other bodies in there, and then specifically a new tomb in which no one had been laid.
Right.
So that when they say there's an empty tomb, nobody can come along and say, well, are you sure it wasn't somebody else, or someone stole the body, or it got lost or something? No, it has to be an empty tomb. And so you're right that when you those little questions, are we sure that he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb in the way that it's described? And if you start to notice apologetical motivations potentially in those very stories, it starts to undermine the historicity a little bit. Like how Matthew's gospel is the only one that mentions the guards at the tomb.
Right.
Basically, the question is there a development in the Gospels regarding the story of the empty tomb that suggests an apologetic angle that undermines its historicity? And this is the one clip that actually came from Alex instead of Rhett.
Yes. Well, there's so many things one would like to say about this. Let me just list a few points. First, Mark's account of the empty tomb is striking precisely because of the absence of such apologetic and theological motifs. It seems to be a pretty straightforward account of what actually happened. Secondly, it's not clear that these differences in the later Gospels are due to apologetic motifs. Ask yourself, how would it help to say that it was a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid? What would that refute? He must be thinking that there's some detractor or opponent of the disciples who said, you confused the remains of Jesus with the remains of someone else, that you thought he was risen from the dead, but in fact he wasn't. But there was never any dispute over the identification of Jesus' remains. A man who had been crucified 3 days earlier would be easy to identify. So I don't see that these differences are motivated by apologetical considerations. Finally, these details tend to be in the secondary circumstantial features of the narratives and not in their historical core. And that's why the vast majority of scholars treat the empty tomb narrative fundamentally historical, even though you do have these additional details in the later Gospels that you don't have in Mark.
That's a great take. One thing that came to my mind is even if there was an apologetic angle here, it wouldn't necessarily undermine its historicity. I mean, the end of John says Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but they're written so you may believe Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. John puts his cards on the table.
Yeah.
But of course, that's why he points towards miracles. That's why we can assess the eyewitnesses. And so if there's a bias, we still have to ask the question, what does that bias cause? Blindness? Belief in the truth? Does that affect the way they report the facts? I don't think it even follows that it's unreliable if there's an apologetic angle at all. Yeah,
you're absolutely right about that. At most, an apologetic interest would tell us why the author included the detail, but it does absolutely nothing to prove that the detail is therefore non-historical. It would just talk to us or tell us something about the author's motivations. So even given that these motifs were apologetical in nature, you're quite right that all this speaks to is the motivation of the author, and it says nothing about the facticity of the details related.
Okay, so I won't say much about this because this is really more just getting into whether or not the resurrection happened. But again, just in defense of the deconstruction that comes as a result of investigating this, the point that Rhett is making here is, or that Alex O'Connor at this point is making, sure, maybe it's a fair point that why would Mark even write this gospel at all if nothing happened, right? Like if there was no resurrection or no something crazy didn't happen, there probably wouldn't be a gospel. However, just because that was written originally doesn't necessarily mean that the resurrection occurred, and the belief that the resurrection occurred was kind of built into the subsequent narratives of the later gospels like Matthew and Luke and John. So it doesn't necessarily prove that the resurrection happened because of what they're saying here. Because Mark could be indicating something else that happened, or something mysterious that happened and we don't know exactly what it is, and eventually it came to be known as the resurrection. It's just, that's all part of the discussion. But the point is, there's certainly nothing conclusive about this, and it's totally understandable that someone would look at all of that evidence and recognize or there would be no recognition of something so definitive as a resurrection.
3 more clips, Bill. Let's take a look at clip number 8.
There was this one summer that some Mormon missionaries, like I was out of the country doing some missionary work, and Link was still in Raleigh, and there were Mormon missionaries that came to talk to him, they ended up coming back like 4 or 5 times because Link, at the time, especially at the time, wasn't controversial. It wasn't confrontational. He was just like, yeah, you guys. So they went through the whole spiel or whatever. And then when I got back, I was like, you let them come like 5 times? You didn't ever challenge them? He was like, well, I was just kind of waiting. I ended up writing this like pamphlet. I would do this all the time. I would write like little papers or pamphlets or whatever. And there was one that was like, this is what you need to say the next time the Mormons come to your door, right? Because you can take apart their theology and their history in a much, it's so recent, right? So that was my perspective. And I find it so interesting that the average Christian apologist, the level of scrutiny they apply to criticizing Mormonism, if they would just for a moment turn that level of scrutiny on their own story, you'd be like, guys, come on, do you see what you're doing? Or like, and if you had been born in a Muslim country and you were of the Muslim faith and you didn't believe that Jesus actually raised from the dead, what would your Muslim apologetic about the resurrection be? Like, do you really think these arguments are strong? Or is it just you need them to be true?
Yeah.
It's so foundational to who you are. You need this to be true.
Really, the question is here, do apologists fail to put the same level of scrutiny on their own beliefs as they do on, say, Mormonism or Islam? And do apologists, need Christianity to be true and thus have a double standard they apply to their own faith?
I think this is just manifestly false, that Christian apologists do not apply the same level of scrutiny to their own beliefs as they do to Mormonism, for example. And if they did, they would be skeptical. New Testament scholars like N.T. Wright, Dale Allison, Michael Licona do exactly that. They apply the same sort of scrutiny to the biblical narrative one would to Mormonism, the religions, and they determine that these are credible accounts to be believed. Now, he also asks, if you were a Muslim, what would be your apologetic against Jesus' resurrection? Well, we know the answer to that question because there are so many Muslims. A popular level Muslim will typically say that Jesus never really died, that he was never crucified and therefore never buried. Sometimes they will believe that it was Judas Iscariot who was crucified by mistake in Jesus' place. That's what Muslims say. And you can weigh on your own whether or not that's a historically credible hypothesis.
Bill, I think it's certainly true that some apologists do this. I mean, there are some apologists that are not as careful as they need to be, but when I was doing my work on the apostles, I distinctly remember Mike Licona said to me, he goes, okay, Sean, you've got to be critical. Ask yourself, would a Muslim scholar or an atheist scholar accept this? And he was my outside reviewer pressing me to be as objective and careful as I could. So I think there is a practice among the scholars you mentioned and many others to be critical of our own beliefs and see if they actually can hold up to scrutiny. But nonetheless, this is just a reminder to keep doing that well.
Sure.
Clip number.
Okay, so yeah, of course he's going to say, well, no, of course we investigate it with total neutrality and objectivity. And, we investigate as, we scrutinize our own beliefs as much as anyone else's. I mean, of course, an apologist will say that, right? And maybe that they intentionally are doing that. Maybe the goal is to be doing that. And I think a lot of apologists think that they are doing that. But then the problem is, this is where the psychological aspect starts to come in. The cognitive mechanisms that we have, we don't realize often are biases, right? And so it's a tricky thing to figure out how to break outside of the box of our own biases. And so the problem there is that those biases and those presuppositions and proclivities, they can mold our investigation and kind of push us in a particular direction and make us to see what's the term? Confirmation bias, right? We can see confirmation biases can happen a lot because we just don't realize that it's happening, unfortunately, right? We see the things that we're expecting or wanting to see, the things that affirm what I'm thinking or what I believe. I see those things rather than the things that are opposed to it. So it's kind of a selective sort of way of looking at the world. And again, that's not entirely intentional. That is, it's a psychological thing that that is kind of going on subconsciously. Now, there certainly are people that are aware of that, and the names that he gave, I totally agree with, are great examples of people who have looked objectively at their own faith. And the thing is, these guys are not apologists. Dale Allison is a biblical scholar. Mike Licona is a biblical scholar. N.T. Wright is a historian, biblical scholar. They are all, they're not out there trying to get people to believe. I think the closest might be Mike Licona, but I absolutely see humility and a desire to be receptive to other ideas in him. But again, I think it's because he's not an apologist. He's not looking for ways to argue for his faith and against others. I think he's, as a scholar, genuinely seeking. And that's the way those other scholars are too. So again, there's a lot here about just the difference in approaching this with the worldview of an apologist versus approaching it with the view maybe of a biblical scholar who is just kind of trying to seek truth. But that's a big thing, is being aware of your own biases and being able to identify where you are, where you're being selective about the things that you choose to believe, etc.
We're sitting here having this conversation in the context of 2025, where we have access to all this scholarship. And all this scholarship and all these discussions about these issues are such a recent phenomenon that, first of all, the tiny minority of people who live today, who call themselves Christians, care about this stuff and actually take time to think about it, right? You believe that Jesus rose from the dead if you're a Christian, probably because your parents told you. Like 90% because your parents told you. And then you got into a movement where it's continually confirmed by people who come in and they say some smart stuff about it, and this is why you can trust it. So even if it did happen, it doesn't feel like a really penetrating investigation into the historical circumstances is what's going to make it click and be like, oh, it did happen. Mm-hmm. I looked under the last rock of history and I found the resurrection. Like, it doesn't seem like God intended for that to be the way. If
that's right,
this is clearly this is a revelation. This is like, this is a secret. This is like God's secret information that you can choose to believe, and then your life is transformed. Like, I'm okay with people who frame it in that way. I'm like, well, I still think I think this is a psychological phenomenon. I don't believe it. I'm a skeptic in that regard, but I just find it so interesting the way that some of these apologists go so hard on trying to prove it.
Right. So this question really is about whether or not people are encouraged to undergo an extensive investigation of Christianity with tools that are only recently available. And does apologetics actually change anybody's mind?
Yeah. He says it's not as though people come to faith through historical investigation. And I think that's absolutely true. Most people who believe in Christ do so because they've had a personal experience of the risen Lord. And there's nothing at all irrational about that. Then Rhett asks, why do some apologists go so hard trying to prove this? Do they think this is going to change anybody's mind? Well, I think the answer is because they love people and want them to come to know the joy of knowing Christ and finding eternal life. As Paul said, the love of Christ constrains us, and therefore we persuade men. Moreover, I think it's important to understand that apologetics goes far beyond your immediate evangelist contact. Apologetics helps to shape a cultural milieu in which the gospel can be heard as an intellectually viable option for thinking men and women. People may not come to Christ because of the arguments, but what the arguments and evidence do is they give people the intellectual permission to believe when their hearts are moved. And I think that that's a great accomplishment of apologetics.
That's a really great take. I think a lot of apologists are motivated by trying to figure out, they have their own questions and doubts and want to know if this is reasonable as well. But someone asked me, they're like, how would you describe apologetics in one word? And I said, love. When done correctly, it's a way of loving our neighbors and loving the church. So I love that take that you gave.
Yeah, I remember one person said it's one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread.
That's good stuff. All right, final clip here.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I don't have much to say about that. I will say, I think part of, and again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think part of Rhett's point here is not just people aren't going to be persuaded by the intellectual arguments. I think the other part of his point here is that it's kind of strange. It's sort of like an air that the apologists or anybody who's trying to maybe get others to believe what they believe. It's kind of strange that they would try to look so hard or try so hard to get others to believe the same things, or to help make them change their mind about something, because it's almost like if you were really truly confident in the truth of what you believe, then you wouldn't necessarily have to fight for it so hard. It would just kind of emerge naturally. That I think that there's maybe more nuance to that. Just as a side comment, I think it's not just about the fact that people won't be persuaded by intellectual arguments. It's also about the fact that there's just something weird that comes off when you've got people who are just trying so hard to get others to believe something else. It's just it's a vibe.
Religion works. I definitely believe that we created it, but we created it because we needed it to some degree for the ritual, the community, the sense of awe, these things that are essential to the human experience that I do think you can experience outside of a religious community. But for most of history, religious communities have done that best. And when you have kids and you're raising a family and you're looking for purpose and meaning and structure, you can choose to hodgepodge create that on your own, or you can plug into a community that has a set of shared myths. And that's a really difficult thing to navigate.
Here's really the question, Bill. Did we create religion because we needed it?
You know, you might as well say that an internal combustion engine created gasoline because it needs it. I agree that man is oriented toward the transcendent. We were made in God's image, made to know him. And so our needing God is exactly what you would expect if God did create us to know him. So this is not at all surprising.
You know, I think some religion could be explained as being invented. There's certain things for power and control, but I have no interest in defending religion per se. I find within Christianity some powerful things that are so unlikely to have been invented. Like, again, the crucifixion, they'd never invent that as a death that's so dishonorable. The idea that if you have a thought of anger or a thought of lust, you're guilty of murder or you're guilty of adultery. Even the idea of grace is beautiful when we understand it, but there's a reason why all other religions are based on some kind of works that you do. There's something counterintuitive about it. And even things in the Gospels, like when there were controversies in the early church, Jesus so easily, or some of the early writers could have invented words to put in Jesus's mouth to settle controversies, and they don't. And so I just don't think we find the marks of invention within Christianity that we do in so many other faiths.
Yeah, that's well said.
Bill, thanks for weighing in here.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is kind of broad, so there's not really much that, I mean, there's a lot that could be said about this, but not much, I guess, that I would say about it other than that's a take on the cognitive science of religion. So the field, the cognitive science of religion, it's been developing over the past couple of decades, and we've made some interesting advances. And we do have at least a good idea of how religion has emerged throughout humanity over time. And sure, that it doesn't, there are kind of aspects of the evolutionary psychology of it, the biological mechanisms of it, the cognitive mechanisms of it. Sure, that doesn't necessarily prove religion to be false. There is one scholar in particular named Justin Barrett who argues for the fact that, yes, sure, God would create humans with this evolutionary structure that eventually leads them to be opened up to the God that exists, right? The God that created us. So sure, that's a take. That I don't know. It doesn't seem like they were really setting out to prove anything too concretely. I mean, this was a very, very brief response. But point being, there's nothing here that requires us to believe that our cognitive disposition towards religion or towards God necessarily means that it's true or that God exists. It could go either way. Again, it's one of those either or. There are explanations on one side of it, on the naturalistic side. There are explanations on the theistic side. So, all this to say, these things that the points that Rhett is making are valid, and they're things that really all Christians should be thinking about. And I think maybe for a lot of people, it could strengthen their faith to, figure out if they believe these things or trust the faith that they've always had or whatever. I think it's a possible consequence that people will lose their faith, kind of like Rhett. But I don't think that seeking truth and delving into these complex and maybe risky, to put a term, it might be intellectually risky for people who are worried about losing their faith. But I mean, that's better than not delving into it at all and trying to hide from truth. So anyway, again, the point is that his points are quite valid.
Final thoughts or reflections on watching this that we maybe missed?
Yeah, I found Rhett to be a very amiable and likable fellow. And honestly, my heart just breaks for him, Sean, when I see how he's rejected Christian faith so unnecessarily based upon a distorted web of Christian beliefs, and so incurious about things like resurrection of Jesus. I hope that maybe as a result of our interview today, if he watches it, that he might be provoked to look into some of these things more deeply and to ask himself if it really could be true.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. Always appreciate your compassion and thoughtfulness, Bill. I've actually reached out to Rhett and Link, his partner, a few times, had my team reach out. No response. He's busy, but I would certainly love to have that conversation with him if he was open and willing to do so.
Man. Okay, so this is, for lack of a better term, the most egregious part of this response. And, again, I say this having respected Dr. Craig for a long time and having learned so much from him over the years. But this comment is really just unfortunate. And the reason is, well, again, I think the idea that Rhett is incurious is incredibly unfair. I think that this is a guy, he talked about this in his interview. He was really invested in his faith. He was really involved in apologetics, in ministry, and it was the investigations that he made. And I'm sure he's an intelligent person, right? He was an engineer. I'm sure that it's the investigations and the analysis that he's done that have gotten him to not just after that first domino, to follow the trail of dominoes and see where it led. And for him, that led to him losing his faith. And that comes from the curiosity. Changing your worldview comes from an incredible respect for curiosity and investigation. So I just don't think that that's a fair thing to say. But also, just the idea that he's so sorry for Rhett about the fact that he's, just so intellectually lost or whatever. I mean, this is almost offensive. I mean, it's kind of like if I were to say, oh my gosh, like I'm so sad for Dr. Craig and Dr. McDowell that they just don't understand the world well enough, and they haven't investigated the world. And, I hope that one day they see the truth. They see how wrong they really are. And then, do you see how that sounds? I mean, it's just like, it's a condescending attitude, and I don't think that he means it this way. I've followed Dr. Craig's work for a long time, and I've seen him, at least online, in a lot of capacities, and he presents himself in a very respectful and humble manner. However, I think it's this cognitive, psychological in our minds that, or at least in the minds of a lot of Christians and particularly apologists, that makes them say things like this. They come from this position where they believe that they are so certain. Again, this is where the certainty comes in. They believe that they are so certain about something, and that they believe that they are right about it. And that's kind of a problematic place to be, to sit on this high horse and kind of judge what everyone else believes with respect to what you believe, and make judgment statements like, or statements like, I just pity them so much because they're just, they just are so lost and they don't understand. And one day maybe they will understand what I understand. There's an arrogance, again, not an intentional arrogance, but there's an inherent arrogance that comes with that, with this idea that you are, this certainty that makes you so confident that you're right and all those other people are wrong, such to the extent that you just feel sad for them. It's an unfortunate way of looking at the people around you, I think. But in any case, that's just, I don't know, that's my take.
Watching this, sorry about some of the tech issues. I don't know why things paused. We hopefully edited this together in a way that's helpful for you. But let me know if these kind of reaction videos are helpful. I've done a few recently. I don't run primarily reaction video channel, but now and then videos come up. I want to give your...
Okay, so that's that. I hope all of that stuff made sense. I don't think I have any closing thoughts. I believe that I said everything that I wanted to say just in response to each of those points. So thanks for listening, and I guess I'll see you next time.